When you think about the link between cars and watches, your mind likely goes to an obvious place. That's racing chronographs. You might think of Heuer putting stopwatches on race car dashboards, leather straps punched with holes that look like driver's gloves. That connection is real, but it's largely superficial. The history of how automotive design shaped watchmaking is far deeper than stopwatches or leather straps. Historically, Swiss watch companies were run by watchmakers or casemakers. And if you wanted a new visual language, you had to look outside the Swiss valleys entirely to designers, sculptors, and again, people that had spent their entire careers designing cars. Start with the most literal example there is. Ferdinand Alexander Porsche designed the very first 911, which was introduced in 1963. It would go on to become the company's entire identity. A few years later, he introduced his own design studio, Porsche Design, entirely separate from the car company. And its first product? A watch. The Chronograph 1, released in 1972, is widely credited as the world's first entirely black PVD wristwatch, which was inspired directly by the 911's own dashboard, built on the same principle of matte black surfaces, high contrast, and legibility from any angle and any light. Porsche Design would later enter a long partnership with IWC, producing an almost two-decade run of uniquely influential watches, such as a chronograph with a hidden compass built into the case, and eventually the Titan, the first production titanium watch built with a fully integrated titanium bracelet. By IWC's own account, this partnership didn't just produce interesting objects. It helped to revive a company that was struggling to find its footing after the quartz revolution. Just 11 years after Porsche Design's very first watch, another car designer would get his own commission, and this time from Japan. Giorgetto Giugiaro never touched a watch until his 40s, but the same couldn't be said for cars because he would found Italo Design in 1968, where he would spend the next 15 years helping to define what car designers call the folded paper era, one of sharp planar surfaces, hard creases, and exaggerated geometry. He was the one who designed the very first Volkswagen Golf, the DeLorean, and the Lotus Esprit. In 1963, Seiko would commission Giugiaro specifically because he wasn't a watch designer, and to design a collection that was aimed entirely at young motorists. Giugiaro came to the task with the same focus that he would have with cars. Start with ergonomics. The result was the SSBA 023, with its tilted digital display so that time could be read while riding or driving without turning your wrist. There was the 7828 6000, which you'll likely know by the name Bishop. It used an offset case so that the crown wouldn't catch your jacket cuff, while the 7828 7009, the Ripley, positioned its chronograph pushers to stay reachable regardless of the angle of the wrist. It's the same folded paper language that made its cars look like objects of the future, this time applied directly to a wristwatch. And it's the reason two of those watches ended up on the wrists of Sigourney Weaver and Lance Henriksen in Aliens just 3 years later. But while Seiko was building watches for young motorists, Timex set out to build a watch for endurance athletes, and they handed that brief to Jean Houlihan. Now, Houlihan had worked previously at General Motors styling, working on cars like the Buick Riviera Bobtail. Later in his career, he would go on to join Timex in 1979, where he mentioned that watch design was the closest thing to automotive design in his entire career, which would explain why he approached the task of designing a triathlon watch like he was designing a chassis rather than a doll. How could the watch be designed in a way to improve the interaction between it and the wearer? At the time, he worked directly with elite runners like Alberto Salazar, who pushed for one specific thing: quick, uncomplicated access to lap timing without looking down and breaking your stride to find the right button. The result was the Timex Triathlon, a distinctive D-shaped upper profile with two top-mounted buttons that felt like dashboard controls. In 1984, Timex brought 1,500 of these prototypes to the Hawaiian Ironman competition and sold every single one on site. The Timex Triathlon became so successful and synonymous with the Ironman triathlon that just 2 years later, having secured the rights to the name of the race, Timex re-released the design as the Ironman. Its now iconic pure gray case was coated in genuine DuPont automotive paint, inspired by Houlihan's own account, by a BMW he saw parked outside of Timex's offices during one of his brainstorms. The Ironman sold over 400,000 units in its first year alone, and became the best-selling single watch style in history. Around the same time across the Atlantic, Heuer was making its own attempt at reinvention. In 1985, the struggling company, which had spent decades establishing its identity around racing chronographs, was acquired by Technique's avant-garde, TAG, who were a high-tech engineering firm that built turbocharged engines for Formula One and even co-owned the McLaren team at the time. Their first release under a new Tag Heuer name in 1986 was called the Formula One, designed by Eddie Bergener in a way that no Heuer watch had before, with a stainless steel core that was wrapped entirely in colorful, high-density fiberglass, economical enough to manufacture at scale and bright enough to look nothing like traditional Swiss watchmaking. And it worked. Tag Heuer sold over 3 million units between 1986 and 2000. The brand's own heritage director even says that it was the gateway watch for an entire generation of collectors. And just 15 years later from the end of that run, after the crisis of design had passed, a new question had taken its place. How do you define avant-garde for a new millennium? That answer, again, came from someone trained in cars. Fabrizio Budimassa-Stigliani trained at Fiat's Style Center in Turin, designing cars and scooters before joining Bulgari's watch division in 2001. His first assignment had nothing to do with thinness or innovation. He was tasked with designing a bracelet for the octagonal Octo case that Bulgari had just acquired from Giorgetto, a heavy step case that spent a better part of a decade without a clear identity. Now, Fabrizio had been clear before about where his design instincts come from, stating that the shape of a vehicle must suggest its use, its performance, and in some cases, a dream. And he believed that watches have the same goals, but with the harder task of fitting all those ideas within a space that's just 40 millimeters across. When he finally got the chance to rebuild the Octo into the Finissimo in 2014, the watch became a complex 110 faceted structure, constantly catching and redirecting light from its surroundings. Pairing that automotive surface logic with Swiss ultra-thin engineering, the Octo Finissimo has since broken multiple world records for thinness. In the same year that Fabrizio joined Bulgari, Richard Mille founded his own brand. Now, Richard wasn't a trained watchmaker or designer himself, but he did have 25 years of experience in the watch industry. What he brought was a philosophy. Use F1 engineering as the actual blueprint, not just the branding. Richard Mille did away with precious metals as the primary structural material, building instead with titanium and carbon composites, where most watches separate a fragile movement from a protective case. Most RM watches build the two as one bonded continuous structure, the movement mounted directly onto a rigid base plate, the same way a modern race engine is bolted rigidly in place, as a load-bearing part of the chassis, rather than being isolated on soft mounts like typical cars. Shock doesn't get cushioned away. It gets distributed across the entire structure at once, the same principle that lets the F1 monocoques survive a violent crash. Within 2 decades, that visual language, skeletonized, architectural, and exposed, became the default aesthetic for hyper-luxury watchmaking. The same way most people picture a Submariner when someone says luxury watch. An entire generation now pictures something that looks like an RM the instant someone says hyper-luxury. Looking back across these 5 stories, there's something that's easy to miss. Watchmaking, for most of its history, judged itself by an entirely different set of values, by precious materials, complications, heritage, and ornament. Somewhere along the way, though, an entirely different vocabulary took over. People started thinking about ergonomics, wearability, and performance. That language isn't intrinsically native to horology. It's automotive thinking, worn down and absorbed until it became synonymous with watches. Unlike most luxury objects, a watch has to survive impacts, be read instantly and operable without too much fuss, which makes it structurally closer to a dashboard than a piece of jewelry. Car designers didn't just notice that, they kept getting invited to improve upon it. The result is that most people valuing a watch today, whether they know it or not, are applying a value system that traditional watchmaking didn't come up with on its own. It came from somewhere else entirely. From a group of car designers decade after decade, treating a watch as if it were a miniature automotive machine.